Any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic.
Welcome, everybody, to this episode of the Arthur C. Clarke Center for Human Imagination's Into the Impossible podcast. I'm your host, the ever-fearful Brian Keating. And today, it's quite a treat to be joined by first-time author and longtime reporter, Chase Purdy. And the first thing I want to ask you is, I grew up in Purdy's, New York. You have any relation to the Purdys of New York?
I don't know. I doubt it, because I'm from the Purdys of Louisville, Kentucky. So
okay, you might have made it out there. Who knows? You might be have some DNA still in Purdy's, New York. And if not, you could just go there and say it's your town.
it's true.
Chase is a reporter who has written a wonderful new book, which I devoured, no pun intended, called $1 Billion Burger. And it's the story of a new type of technology that has potential to both do well and do good, and that is, the quest for artificial or synthetic or lab grown meat, and the experiences, as I described the book before we started talking, recording rather, is sort of it's sort of like a diary mixed with investigative journalism, mixed with an article that you might find, or a treatment that you'd find in the top business journal. So, Chase, first of all, welcome to the Into the Impossible podcast. Where are you currently located?
Thanks for having me. I am currently still in sort of self-imposed quarantine in Brooklyn, New York. You can tell it's very hot in this apartment. It's getting warm out there.
I just did a podcast with folks out on Long Island, where I'm from originally, before Purdy's. I was on Long Island. And yeah, they said it's in the 80s out there. So, we have to deal with this weather behind me at the South Pole. It's in the low negative 80s there. So it's 100, 200 degrees cold. So I wanted to have you on ever since I found out about this book coming out, because as I said, we focus here in the Arthur C. Clarke Center on the future of all things related to humanity. And one of those things, of course, is our sustenance as human beings. It's one of the things that makes us human. So I want to read just a quick blurb about the book, which the full title is $1 Billion Burger, Inside Big Tech's Race for the Future of Food. It's been called fascinating and relevant to timely issues like environmental sustainability and global food systems. And kind of the extended quote about it is how this band of doctors, scientists, activists, and entrepreneurs have been racing to end animal agriculture as we know it, hoping to fulfill a dream of creating meat without ever having to kill an animal. In the laboratories of Silicon Valley, companies and Dutch universities, visionaries are growing burgers and steaks from microscopic animal cells and inventing systems to do so at scale, allowing us to feed the world without slaughter and environmental devastation. So the first thing I always like to ask authors, we have a lot of authors that come on the show. The first thing I always ask is, unlike the advice, I always judge books by their covers. And I'd like to know, how did you come up with the cover idea? How did you come up with the title, the subtitle? Give us the inside burger baseball story of how did you come up with the title and cover?
Well, I really first have to credit a friend for the working title and working cover that we were playing with. The working title of this was The End of Meat. And sort of the abstract cover idea was like the end of meat over sort of this graphic of an upside down pig. But the more that we started talking about this on the editorial level, and not just my friends, this really wasn't about the end of meat. This is sort of about a continuation or the evolution of meat. And so the end of meat never really would have fit ultimately. We knew that we wanted to have sort of like a simple sort of cover. We knew that we wanted to really hit on the fact that, one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot through my conversations as I've been reporting on this subject has been that even if a person is uncomfortable with the idea of cell-cultured meat, there is enough money and interest behind it that it is going to be something that you have to be confronted with at some point or another. And, this is the result of basically you have literal billionaires who are putting money in this. You have, millions and millions of dollars going into this. Basically the idea is that it's it could disrupt this multi-billion-dollar industry even. That's sort of the goal. $1.7 trillion industry, actually. And we really wanted to get across to people who would pick this up is that this is something that could be like this massive disruptor. And what better way than to sort of wrap in the fact that billionaires are interested, that it's going to challenge like a multi-billion-dollar industry, than to sort of get on the cover of this like billion-dollar burger. And the idea of the graphics behind it, which is just sort of two burger buns with sort of some molecular sort of graphics, or between the burger buns. It's sort of to communicate, I think, sort of obviously like this is really sort of heavy duty science stuff that's going into this, and like this is sort of like a reimagination of like what you're used to.
And the connection to technology obviously is not to be really overlooked. I think it's sort of interesting, this confluence that I thought about. I lived in the Bay Area in Silicon Valley for only about a year, but I'm pretty familiar with the culture. We've had on a lot of innovators and people from Silicon Valley. And, to a person, I don't think that there's anyone who's opposed to this project. And that's sort of unique in Silicon Valley. I mean, you can think about all this stuff. I had on Sarah Fryer, who wrote No Filter, which is this inside story of Instagram, and how that's it's been called the social network of Instagram, that equivalent type of a book. And she is not she doesn't spare the criticism that has come about from this technology of social media, whether it's people putting their plastic surgery on Instagram, or bullying and these cliques of children, and how Instagram can be abused. But, the first thing that I started thinking about that is, and maybe I'm wrong, but it seems like this only has upside. I don't just mean the financial. I mean the lack of using animals to provide this meat, the impact on the environment, the impact really maybe ethically, and certainly now highlighted more than ever. And I want to hear your take on this, by COVID, which has really been traced in some part, I should say, to the slaughterhouses and the outbreaks in there. So first, I'm rambling a little bit, but I'd like to know, does this have any downsides? Except for, people might lose money, and that's just the nature of our capitalist economy. But is there a downside to it, in your opinion?
I think that this really hits on like a fascinating element of something that I figured out as I started really digging into this space, is that there is a divide when you talk to the entrepreneurs and the innovators who are behind this, is that when you talk to them about cell-cultured meat, some of them refer to it as technology and some of them refer to it as food. And I think that one of the things that sort of really separates this from like an Instagram or social media in Silicon Valley is that food is an incredibly emotional, incredibly political, incredibly personal thing that we interact with. Every single person, no matter how much money you have, that could like sort of change what kinds of foods you can eat, but we all eat the same way. It goes through the same orifice in our body.
Hardware, billion-year-old hardware.
and for that reason, I think that you're going to find some people saying like, "Oh, there is a downside." I think that you would talk to, not very far out of Silicon Valley herself, Alice Waters, who would say that we're getting way too far from nature, and that in doing this, you sort of think that we're almost challenging nature in some way, that like we can do better. And I think for people who come from that perspective, I think that this is a downside, that this is sort of the granddaddy of processed foods in some way. And we've seen what processed foods, not a fair comparison, but like, Pop-Tarts haven't really done that much for our health. And it's also a super processed food. So I think that you can really start diving into lots of conversations around what this means on like an emotional level or on like sort of a natural level that like poses lots of big questions about whether this has a downside or not. But to the things that you brought up, the impact on climate change, how this could really, COVID-19 is an excellent example. I think that, in fact, I think COVID-19 is sort of a horrible gift that now this sort of nascent industry has. If you think about before this virus and this pandemic sort of set in, when you read about cell-cultured meat, if you read about it, you probably mostly heard two things. It's going to be so much better when it comes to like sort of the effort to combat climate change, and it's going to result in killing a lot fewer animals. And those are huge upsides. What COVID-19 has done is it has exposed, at least especially in the US, that the US meat system is fraught with problems. I mean, think about it has exposed to us more about the labor conditions inside the meat packing plants and how tightly packed everything still is, because we don't use robots to tear apart carcasses that come down the assembly line because they're all different shapes and sizes. We still need humans to do this, and they're shoulder to shoulder doing the nitty gritty hard work of packaging, of ripping apart and packaging our meat for us. And I think that this has unveiled for us, in a very real way, that we maybe aren't that far off from where we were in the jungle when Upton Sinclair wrote his famous book. I think that it sort of shows the weakness of having this hyper-consolidated meat system where a very tiny handful of companies and a very tiny handful of factories are responsible for putting out 85% of our meat. That way, if you have 9 meat packing plants shut down, suddenly 25% of the meat supply is impacted. And so suddenly I think that these industry groups can, these sort of cell-cultured meat startups are suddenly going to be able to seize on all of these very real downsides in the current meat system, which have resulted in higher meat prices, which have resulted in CEOs with Smithfield and Tyson saying, oh my gosh, like, we all better prepare. This could be bad for our meat supply. There could be shortages. And I think that, in addition to all the climate-related upsides, we're now seeing some new upsides.
Yeah. So one of our guests recently, Peter Diamandis, who is known for, I call him the most optimistic pessimist or the most pessimistic optimist, but he talks about these 6 exponential Ds, or these 6 Ds of exponential growth. And one of those is disruptive. And this applied when I had the conversation with Sarah Fryer about Instagram, her book, No Filter. And that's how, companies like Kodak and other companies really didn't see this coming. And I wonder, for these Tysons and these other companies, besides obviously they're going to lobby and they're going to try to stay entrenched, do you see opportunities for these companies that are actually the traditional farm or kind of slaughterhouse, et cetera, meat packaging industries of today to benefit, or are they just going to do what Kodak did and lose this overall battle for what could be doing well while doing good?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question, and I think that I spend a decent amount of time in the book, I think, looking back at some of the food fights in America, and for listeners, one of the early food fights that actually led to the creation of the dairy lobby was the butter people being so threatened by the arrival of margarine that they just went bonkers in state houses across this country, and in Washington, to try to get legislation passed that would basically legislate margarine out of existence. I think that we see it today whenever we see the dairy industry again, like feeling so threatened by plant-based milks that they are like doing everything they can, and they failed so far in the judiciary, but they're doing everything they can now through the legislative branch to like basically make it so that you can't call almond milk because consumers are just going to be so confused. And I think that the meat people have learned, some of them at least, a little bit from that. And I think that's evident from high-profile appearances that CEOs of big meat companies have made, where they've used language that kind of shows it. I think it was Tom Hayes, he's the former CEO of Tyson, appeared on like Fox Business a year and a half ago, and he started using language where he basically specifically said, like, oh, we're not a meat company anymore, we're a protein company. Because they see that there is interest in plant-based protein. They see that there could be interest in cell-cultured protein. they see that there is still interest in animal-based protein. And the fact that these big companies that have always identified as meat companies are now calling themselves protein companies signals to me that they see almost like the writing on the wall, that there are future foods out there, that people are very curious about them and eager to try them. And I think that cell-cultured meat is one of those foods and will be one of those foods. And, this would still be a tough thing to attain, but analysts at Rabobank, when you ask them about this, they would say it would only take sort of this alternative seizing 5% of the total market share to sort of basically amount to like, it would be a major disruption.
Yeah. And when you, another question that kind of paralleled to me, this notion of Silicon Valley startup that runs throughout this book, obviously throughout Sarah's book as well, is this notion of first mover advantage and whether or not there really will be a, such a thing that will take place. For some of the companies that you talk about, I'm showing one now behind me, this Just Meat, which this doesn't exist, right? You cannot buy the pack of chicken that I'm showing here, I believe, right?
Yeah, I see it.
That's sort of wishful, or not wishful thinking, but aspirational, I'll say. This is from the Guardian article not too long ago. Do you see the parallels there with, say, a Facebook or something like that, where maybe they won't be the first company to actually get somewhere, won't be the one that makes the breakthrough, but one of the first companies will break through, and then they'll basically put up a barrier that's insurmountable. In other words, will there be maybe a second mover advantage, loosely speaking, or do you think that no, there'll be a wide open spectrum of different alternatives? And I mean, there's only so many different flavors of traditional foods, and the old joke is, what does something taste like if it's some exotic? It tastes like chicken. So I mean, there's chicken, there's duck. You spend a lot of time talking about duck and pate, and yeah, there's all sorts of those. But there's only so many different things that they're going to try to imitate or simulate. Do you see there being this kind of first mover advantage where just a couple companies will stake it out and the rest will be fighting over, the jerky market or something? I don't know.
I think that it's, that's really kind of what goes into this products are so complex that it's hard for me to imagine there being, yes, there's obviously going to be, the first movers are going to get they're going to be the ones who really drag into the public imagination the possibilities and sort of normalize more the idea of cultured meat. And I think that that's a massive role. It's hugely important. And I think that if people are receptive, that there's a lot of money that could then go to these early companies to be better and get better at what they do. But I do think also that, I spend a little bit of time in the book talking about this, but the initial meats that we're going to see are going to be meats that are what we would call today processed meats. Chicken nuggets, burgers, meatballs, chicken tenders, things that, I really hate to put it this way, and I don't want to confuse people. This is not a perfect analogy at all. But if you remember that all of the news stories and controversy around pink slime, that came out many years back. It's basically like a lot of the, when you pull cell-cultured meat out of like the bioreactor, this earlier stage stuff, it's really like malleable. It can be shaped into like nuggets. It can be shaped into meatballs. It's like ground beef, basically. Mm-hmm. And so for those products, that's going to be the first wave. And some companies, particularly one in Israel, Aleph Farms, has basically said, you know what, like, we're not going to be a first wave company. We're going to focus on the really hard task of doing like the really advanced work of figuring out how to grow like a full cut, a steak, for instance, that has like, think about a chicken breast as a good example. You pull apart a chicken nugget, you kind of see that it's like solid, but it's kind of contained within like the fried part of the nugget. You pull apart a chicken breast and you start to notice, oh, this is actually kind of stringy. Mm-hmm. Getting cells to grow in that like stringy structure is very difficult. It's not an easy thing to do. And that gets even more advanced whenever you're talking about a different species like a cow. And so some companies will be in that second wave, but those products that they bring to the market are going to be those like cuts that you can really work with. And I think that they have a lot to gain too once they get to the market.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, there will be an advantage for first movers, but there'll also be a second wave and maybe even a third wave when we're talking about crustacea, when we're talking about fish. I think that's sort of a wide open field of opportunity for these companies that are out there now.
I want to walk
and actually, they're growing kangaroo in Australia, even.
Oh, something exotic. Yeah, I mean, I'm Jewish. I'm not ultra orthodox, but I keep kosher, etc. And I'm just thinking about all these exotic, things you could have. Lobster that's perfectly kosher. Depending on what ingredients go into it. And I want to first take a step back and talk about the science behind it, because it is we have a very tech-minded audience, but we love to nerd out. So I've got an image here from a paper that I'm linking in the show notes. How cell-cultured meat is actually created. Can you spend a little bit of time? I know you're not a scientist necessarily, but can you take a little bit of time to explain like what aspect of this most stood out to you? Because when I see it, I'm like, wow, this all happens naturally and it comes out delicious. But, maybe that's because of our taste buds. It's either the receptor or the producer, and we're just wired for it. Take us through the technology a little bit. I know this isn't, the first time you're seeing this particular image, but I think that the reactions are sort of common and discussed throughout the book. So
sure.
Walk us through, how does it work? How does cultured meat come about?
Well, you basically just need, on the simplest level, it's a pretty simple recipe. You need three things. You need cells. You need food that those cells can eat and then helps them proliferate. And you need a controlled environment, a sort of controlled and sterile environment for them to grow in that can kind of mimic all the environmental aspects of growth that they love. In nature, a cow is basically a bioreactor. It's just a walking, living bioreactor. And the blood inside the cow delivers the nutrients to the cells for them to sort of grow and replicate over and over again. So the first thing is, you needed to be able to do a sort of very basic, simple biopsy on an animal to collect cells. Stem cells are what these scientists really love. And essentially, those cells can come from any part of the body. Just likes to sort of tout the idea that you can take a cell from the tip of a feather, and you basically scientists know how to basically take these cells and get them to go back into what's called a pluripotent state, which the way I sort of phrase it in the book is that they're all different kinds of cells that are responsible for all different kinds of things. Some grow into feathers, some grow into muscle tissue, some grow into fat tissue, some grow into connective tissue. And if you think about cells working on a construction site, is how I used it, is that you have electricians, you have carpenters, you have surveyors, and they all sort of work harmoniously to build this like bigger structure. But it is possible to take a construction site worker who's a carpenter, and you can send her back to school and you can teach her how to do like wiring and all sorts of like, electrical stuff, and stick her back out into the construction site to be an electrician. And the same works for these cells. You can take a cell from the tip of a feather, send it back to school, a pluripotent state, and it's at the state where it can choose a new life adventure. And maybe that's a muscle tissue. Maybe that's to become fat tissue. So the cells then do that. So you get these cells, and they need to basically eat. And what they eat is this liquid medium. For a long time, this liquid medium was fetal bovine serum, which is essentially exactly what it sounds like. It's the blood from a cow fetus, which is so rich in nutrients and is exactly what some cells really love to be able to like replicate. No one's using that anymore. It's way too expensive. And for the vegans who are largely behind these companies, they have sort of ethical concerns with that. And so there are now plant-based mediums. There are synthetic mediums. And these are sort of closely guarded intellectual property witch's brews full of nutrients, the amino acids, the proteins, everything that you need to get certain species of cells to grow into healthy sort of tissue. And all of that happens inside a bioreactor. And there are different kinds of bioreactors, but essentially a bioreactor is a space that maintains a temperature and pH levels and oxygen levels. It sort of stirs, it's able to stir the liquid medium, the liquid around enough to keep the oxygen like sort of the same throughout it. And it basically just creates the conditions so that over a course of like several days or weeks, these cells proliferate and become, a fully formed like clump of tissue, basically. Mm-hmm. And then you centrifuge that bioreactor and scrape the tissue out, and then you can hand that over to sort of a product engineer, or which is very often a chef that's been hired by these companies to then play with it and figure out, okay, we have this real meat, we have the muscle tissue, we have the fat tissue, mm-hmm. Stick the two together, and what can we make? And that's sort of the very simple, sort of dumbed down version of how this happens. And that's, when I say dumbed down version, I mean the version that I need to work with whenever I write this stuff, because it's a lot of it is so far over my head.
Yeah, it's incredibly advanced biotechnology, and it's being used for, as we said, the potential both to improve through disruption, as Peter Diamandis would say, both the economy, the environment, and also maybe ethical treatment of animals. So I want to talk a little bit about the side of things that maybe people don't really think about. We went through the technology, but how does it compare when we think about existing things that you can go down to? You can't buy these yet, right? You can't buy the $1 billion burger, even if you could afford it. Right? They're about $500. Yeah, they're about $500. I think the culmination of the book, you're saying it's about $500. How do these compare with traditional, vegan alternatives, which I've tried, which are great? The Beyond products, they're delicious, and I'm a big time. I love eating meat. I'm sorry to say, I know in 100 years when this podcast is unveiled, I'll be canceled, etc. But I do eat meat. I try to minimize it, and one of the ways I minimize it is instead of having 2 sausage links, I'll have one Beyond Possible sausage patty, and then one kosher sausage patty. So and they taste really good, delicious. In fact, maybe not super nutritious, but they don't taste like the other one. I'm having 2, one burger that's chuck meat, and the other one that's Beyond Possible. Tastes good. It doesn't taste the same. How do you contrast these two? I forgot if you're vegan or you're semi-vegetarian. How do you characterize yourself?
I would say that I eat about 90% of my diet. 95% is plant-based, but I do have meat from time to time. Mm-hmm. I don't eat pork, mm-hmm. and then I don't eat beef either if I can help it, just because mm-hmm. it is like the biggest contributor.
So for those people who have tried these veggie products, here's some vegetables behind me. How do you characterize? How do you distinguish between them? Do you agree that they don't really taste with me, or what's your thought on the existing products we can buy right now?
Whenever I talk to people about these products, I usually the conclusion that they make and the conclusion that I definitely make is that you can't really eat these, especially in burger form, and like really truly expect it to taste exactly like you want it to taste if you're trying to get that exact mimic. But it does, I think that Impossible gets the texture down really well. I think that the taste is kind of close. I think that the nutrition profile is very, very different. By contrast, what I have tried, and these are like sort of largely fried chicken tenders, chicken salad, duck chorizo, foie gras. I mean, they're the real deal. Mm-hmm. They taste. I mean, I think that I mentioned I tried a chicken tender that Memphis Meat made, and I was humbled by the experience, not just from the taste of it. And they presented it with basically no seasoning. There's a little salt, a little pepper, but they wanted me to eat this product without sort of being dressed up on a burger or anything. And not only was the taste great, but the texture was, pulling it apart and seeing the stringiness was just a crazy experience. And, I think that it comes down to the fact that this is real fat tissue. This is real muscle tissue. This isn't sort of some plant-based interloper that's wanting to be this. This is actually the stuff on a real level, a biochemical level. And that's going to bring about the same taste. I think that the scientists are doing a lot of work on their own, sort of figuring out like what the ratio of fat and muscle tissue is. Because, most of the taste that we taste comes from like fat tissue. Mm-hmm. And I think that like, those ratios are where like all the magic kind of is. But I think they're hands down much more, convincing is the wrong word, because convincing implies that like, it's trying to masquerade as something that it's not. And I would argue that it is real meat. And, but there's really no comparison. There's no comparing plant-based and cell cultured.
Yeah, I can't really wait to try it. So you talk towards the end of the book about the scaling of the price, which literally was $330,000 back when it debuted in 2013 for a burger patty, and now is about $500 per patty. When is that exponential curve? It's another one of Peter's exponential trends. Is this demonetization or reduction in the cost, et cetera, deflationary pressures that will occur because of the disruptive technology. When do you foresee it, going down to your local Jack in the Box or whatever you guys eat in Brooklyn and picking one up?
Yeah, no, I think that this is a great moment to sort of introduce what the issue is here, is that there's definitely some scientific work here that still needs to be mastered. Mm-hmm. But for the simplest products, the tech and science is there. And the number one thing that is absolutely stopping this from becoming like more widely available is the regulatory red tape.
Awesome.
Well, if you want to think like the USDA and the FDA have basically signed a joint agreement that they're going to share the responsibility of overseeing cultured meat production. But they still haven't really laid down in black and white what sort of the ground rules are, what needs to happen, what are the checkpoints. And as soon as they sort of give the green light, as soon as some regulatory agency around the world, maybe it'll be in Singapore first, maybe it'll be in the United Arab Emirates, maybe it'll be Israel, but as soon as some regulatory body somewhere gives the green light, the companies that are in this space are going to say like, okay, now we can very safely build these production facilities that are going to be needed to, at scale, produce what they can already make. It's a tough sort of sell to be like, let's put in millions of dollars to build a production facility and not have, a regulatory green light yet. Mm-hmm. So I think that you could see, and a few companies that have a lot of money, just Memphis Meats, Future Meat Technologies over in Israel, have already broken ground on their pilot production facilities. And so we're getting really, really, really close to that edge where we will start seeing it. And I do think it'll probably be like the Impossible Foods route, the mm-hmm. Impossible Burger, where like they really decided, let's make splashy entrances into different markets, San Francisco, New York, let's partner with chefs, let's drum up media attention and really sort of like spark the curiosity bug in people to want to come out and try it at these sort of fancier or like high profile restaurants and stuff. And then eventually it'll sort of become something that you can get in retail. But I would not be surprised if in a year, people somewhere in the world, I would love for that to be the US just for myself, started to see this as an option in several restaurants.
Mm. So the last thing on my list of specifics about the book before we get into a little bit deeper, more big picture things that I like to ask all my guests. I want to ask, what are the kind of unintended consequences that could come about? You talk a lot in the book about, and I love the scenes where you talk with your mother, because she's just kind of this archetype of the normal quote unquote person who's not like, just born at Texas barbecue and only eats meat. I know some people like that, and she's not like a complete vegan, right? So
No.
she's kind of this proxy for every person. And I want to know, what do you see as the hurdle? There's sort of the yuck factor. Oh, this it's grown in a lab. B, it's grown from DNA, and that could be scary. It's grown in a reactor that has scary connotations. What do you see? I personally came away from the book feeling like that could be one of the hurdles, most significant ones. Where do you see that, and how do you see that being solved? And is there something else I'm overlooking and missing out that you actually think is a deeper part of the story and challenge?
I think that this is all going to ultimately come down to like how these companies, how transparent they are about their processes, and also how they communicate it. I mean, do you really tout this as like a new? Again, I guess back to what we were saying in the very beginning, which is like, do you call this a food or do you call it technology? Do you highlight the fact that it's like this technological bright spot to like the climate change fight, or do you highlight that it's like the process by which you make it, that it's like a cultured and a bioreactor thing, or do you highlight where it comes from? For instance, the company Just, which is featured most heavily in this book, has a deal with a Kobe beef farm that's in Japan, and they are sourcing cells from sort of Kobe beef cows. And they also have a deal with like this sort of very well-known rancher who works with Black Angus cows outside of San Francisco. And do you really highlight that? Do you sort of say like, for the first time, you can buy Kobe beef for really cheap because we're using these like cows that have these really impressive genetics, and we're taking this genetics and we're democratizing this meat that for so long has been well outside the price range of like, your everyday eater. How that's communicated, I think, is going to be like the number one hurdle for people. Because my mom, one of the things that Josh Tetrick, the CEO of Just, asked her is like, what's the biggest thing that's going to stop people in Louisville from eating this? Of course, my mother didn't feel comfortable being the spokesperson for eaters in Louisville, Kentucky, but she sort of thought that, the idea of this being man-made meat is going to be the hurdle. And Josh sort of kept thinking about that throughout the lunch that we had at his company headquarters. He's like, I wouldn't want to eat man-made meat. So it's, how do you sort of, I guess this comes again to like capturing that public imagination. How do you sort of get people to think about this? Is it a fake meat product? Is it that's the tough part, and it's sort of well beyond my pay grade to figure that out for them. But I think that's sort of the trick.
Yeah. Great. Okay, Chase. Well, now we're going to enter, soon we'll enter the spin zone, the plug zone, where you can plug anything you like, especially the book and your writing. But before I do that, I like to ask my authors, especially, how they react to this quote. And this is from the late great Carl Sagan, who I've had his daughter and his widow on the podcast, and this is about a famous quote from her Sasha Sagan's father, Andrew Ian's late husband, and that's what Carl Sagan says is that a book is basically magic. It's a way of turning these squiggles and lines on paper written perhaps long ago and imprinting an idea into somebody's mind perhaps millennia later. And my question to you first is, did you always want to write a book? And do you feel like this book is going to play a role, or has a vision, if you will, to play sort of a role that may last long beyond the current moment that we're in?
Well, the answer to the first part of that question is no. I never imagined myself writing a book. I have always really excel. So I've been a journalist since I graduated from college, and I was a journalist in college. I've always enjoyed writing, but I've always sort of thought that I've excelled at really capturing like emotion and scenes in sort of more shorter kind of like writing. The book is super daunting to me. It was, I mean, luckily I knew, because I reported on this space a lot, I already knew a lot of the people in it, the ins and outs of it. I kind of knew the major challenges, the major players, the biggest themes, the biggest questions. And that really helped me. But, you know, it wasn't an easy process for me. The reporting was fun. It took me all over the world. The toughest part for me about writing a book is trying to like thread a narrative arc. And in this case, it was Josh Tetrick's story across, you know, more than 250 pages. That's just not easy to do, especially when his story is very much in motion. I mean, like every single month, these companies are making like moving forward in leaps and bounds. And to try to capture this man's story while it's evolving was a really tough thing to do and to stretch out. And this isn't a long history. I mean, you know, the book sort of opens on 2013. We've only gone 7 years. I mean, this is sort of a quick caper through a brief history of this technology. And so it was really tough for me to kind of get into a rhythm. But once I did, it was really enjoyable. I actually like the pacing of writing a book. And, you know, the biggest thing that I really hope for it, and one of the things that I think could make it sort of be relevant years ahead, is the book is inherently about people who want to create the change that they want to see. It is ultimately about a man who tried out different ways to like change the world and just didn't really find a way that really worked for him. Mm-hmm. Even after he founded his company, even after it was considered like a unicorn in Silicon Valley, he still didn't really quite know that this was for him. And now he's kind of settled on this trajectory that he wants to go after. And he's started off as a vegan activist who's best friends with a vegan activists. And in a lot of ways, this is a book about vegan activists who sort of, you know, this is sort of a simple way of putting it, but they kind of set down their buckets of red paint that they'd throw on fur coats, selling fashion shows, the sort of absolutist yelling at the top of their lungs mentality, and sort of thought, okay, there has to be another way that we can accomplish our goals. Maybe let's try to play this like capitalist system that we see so much, that we find so problematic. Maybe let's try to subvert it. So let's actually create these businesses that make these products that like are the same thing as meat. And let's try to tackle this problem from within the actual culture that we despise so much. And I think that kind of story of how to be a change maker is something that is a lesson to take from this book. And the second thing I would say is that in terms of the cell-cultured meat technology, this book, first and foremost, I mean, I'm optimistic about this technology. I think it's fascinating. I'm eager to see it develop because I think that the implications are potentially huge. But this book, I think, does tell people, or does sort of suggest to people at least, that it's going to be really important to hold these companies to account. What they are proposing is huge. They want to replace a system of a way that we've been eating meat for a very, 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 very long time. And that comes with a lot of responsibility. It comes with the need to be transparent. It comes with a need for us as consumers to be really thoughtful about what we expect from them. And I hope that that's a takeaway too, is that we continue to be thoughtful and skeptical about these companies, because they deserve our skepticism and our thoughtfulness.
Yeah. Well, that segues perfectly into my next question, which is, if you had to choose between the audience for this readership audience for this book, would you rather it be read, if you could only give it to one, would you rather give it to a skeptic hater on these types of alternatives to meet, or someone who's already a fanboy, fangirl?
I would give it to a skeptic, hands down. I mean, my mom was a skeptic whenever we didn't really even talk much about this topic as I was reporting it, because I just sort of knew where she stood. She was very creeped out by the idea. And so then it was all the more fun to watch her react in the book whenever we went to, I flew her across the country and we went to Just headquarters, and she had to sit down and be confronted with the very thing that made her uncomfortable. And so I think that it's far more interesting to watch a skeptic work through everything in their mind than it is to, hand it off to a fanboy.
Right. Great. And the last question that I like to ask my guests, especially those that have written books, because as I said, books are kind of these time capsules that last for a long time. You're familiar with probably our namesake, Arthur C. Clarke, and his famous book, 2001, which turned into A Space Odyssey by Stanley Kubrick. And some of the scenes in that revolve around this giant monolith, this enormous object whose purpose is not exactly clear, but in the books it represents sort of a time capsule, perhaps a warning, a message delivery device. This is before USB keys and and you could have email, I suppose. So if Chase Purdy were designing a time capsule that had to last 1 billion years, what would you put in it or on it? What would it say or do or represent for a 1 billion-year-long project?
Anytime people talk about time capsules, or I'm always gravitate, I think, toward the idea that music is something that we sort of pass down or sort of hand off to like someone so far down the road. Mm-hmm. And it's not a single thing per se, but I think that if I had to stick something in a time capsule, it would probably be the complete works of Stephen Sondheim, who I think he composes music that's so complex and sophisticated and really explores in no sort of simple way the human experience, this like relationship between people and art, between spouses with the self, between parents and children, love and loss, ambivalence, passion, and like so much more. And I feel like every time I listen to Sondheim, I always end up learning a little bit something new about myself, some contour of myself, or something that makes me feel inherently like more empathetic and appreciative of like the beauty and the layers of the world around me. Mm-hmm. And it's just like really singular music compared to everything else that you're hearing, whether it's musical theater or like other sort of composition. I think Stephen Sondheim is incredible, and I think that his work should absolutely be heard like 1 trillion years from now.
Well, Chase Purdy, I hope your book will be read, maybe not for 1 trillion years, but I hope it has great success. It's an easy read. It's an enjoyable read. It's a fun read. I like the human component so much. I want to thank you for writing it, and I want to thank you for sharing your time today on the Into the Impossible podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic.
If you enjoyed this episode of Into the Impossible, please subscribe, comment, share, rate, and review. For a chance to win a free copy of our most recent guest's newest book, send a screenshot of your review to info@imagine.ucsd.edu. We appreciate hearing from you and are always open to your suggestions for future episodes. For more information, go to imagination.ucsd.edu. Find us on Twitter @ImagineUCSD. Watch us on YouTube, listen on iTunes. Into the Impossible is a production of the Arthur C. Clarke Center for Human Imagination in the Division of Physical Sciences at the University of California, San Diego. Eric Veary, Director. Brian Keating, co-director. Patrick Coleman, associate director. Produced by Stuart Valco.